On a deafening morning in a Lawrence textile mill, a young girl named Camella Teoli was fed to a machine. When the steel gears tore into her, the factory owners expected her to bleed out quietly and be forgotten. They were wrong. Instead of fading away, she carried her wounds straight into the highest halls of American power to testify against the millionaires who built their fortunes on broken children. To understand how one little girl forced a nation to confront its darkest sins, you have to know the world that tried to destroy her. In the year 1911, the town of Lawrence, Massachusetts, did not belong to its people. It belonged to the mills. These were not mere buildings. They were sprawling, brick-walled fortresses powered by steam and fueled by human exhaustion. Inside the Washington mill, where Camella Teoli spent her days, the noise was a physical weight. The deafening, mechanical roar of the great textile looms never ceased, drowning out any possibility of speech or thought. The air was stifling, kept artificially hot and humid, so the delicate cotton threads would not snap under tension. It was a place built with absolute precision for the supreme efficiency of machines, with entirely no regard for the fragile architecture of the human body. To run this empire of thread and steel, the mill owners required a specific kind of labor. They needed workers who were exceptionally cheap, who were docile, and who possessed hands small enough to reach into the narrow spinning mechanisms of the looms to untangle jams. They found their perfect workforce in children. Lawrence was not an anomaly. It was simply a mirror reflecting the grim reality of a nation. By the year 1900, the United States Census Bureau recorded a truth that the country would later spend decades trying to erase from its collective memory. At least one. 75 million children under the age of 15 were employed full-time in heavy industry. They made up roughly 18% of the entire American workforce. These were children who had never known the inside of a schoolhouse, who rarely saw the sun, and who were quietly robbed of the fundamental right to simply grow up. For the men who sat in velvet-lined boardrooms, these 1.75 million children were not citizens. They were an abundant, endlessly renewable resource, harvested from the poorest neighborhoods and worked to the bone. The violence done to them was not always sudden or bloody. For the young girls standing 12 to 14 hours a day at the spinning frames, death often came in the form of a slow, suffocating white snow. The air in the textile mills was perpetually thick with fine cotton dust. With every breath, these children inhaled the microscopic fibers, which settled deep into their developing lungs. Over time, this constant exposure bred a silent killer, bisonosis, known more plainly in the medical texts of the era as brown lung disease. The girls would develop a chronic, hacking cough. Their chests would tighten, their youthful energy would vanish, and their lungs would slowly necrotize from the inside out. When a girl finally collapsed, entirely spent and gasping for air on the factory floor, there was no scandal. There were no frantic calls for doctors, and certainly no police investigations. Public health reports in the Journal of the American Medical Association noted the devastating prevalence of the disease throughout the 1910s. Yet the law remained intentionally blind. To the men who kept the ledgers, a dying child was not a tragedy. She was merely a broken part in the machinery of greed. When these girls died, the companies would simply dispose of their bodies or return them to their impoverished families without a single word of apology or a cent of compensation. The legal system, which was supposed to be a shield for the vulnerable, acted instead as a wall protecting the powerful. This was the cruel arithmetic of the American Industrial Revolution. A broken gear or a snapped drive belt cost the company money to replace, requiring mechanics, downtime, and lost profits. But a broken child cost them absolutely nothing. There was always another desperate immigrant family stepping off a train, offering up another daughter to feed the looms. The society of the time looked at a generation of children coughing up their lives in the dark, and quietly agreed among themselves that this was simply the price of progress. It was a world that measured the total value of a young girl's life by the pennies she could save them on an hourly wage. The tragedy of Lawrence was not an isolated failing of a single greedy mill, nor was it a local anomaly. It was, rather, a meticulously executed blueprint for the entire United States during those years. What happened to Camella Teoli in Massachusetts was simply one verse in a nationwide chorus of exploitation. From the industrial Northeast to the Deep South, the machinery of the Gilded Age required a constant, uninterrupted sacrifice of youth to keep its gears turning and its profits compounding. The system did not accidentally harm children. It was fundamentally dependent upon them. If you traveled west from the textile mills and descended into the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania, the air turned from cotton-choked white to suffocating, impenetrable black. Here, the industry relied entirely on the labor of the breaker boys. These were children, a great many of them no older than 8 years of age, who were tasked with sorting jagged rock and slate from the coal as it cascaded down massive, splintering wooden chutes. For 14 hours a day, they sat hunched over in near-total darkness, breathing in thick clouds of toxic coal dust that settled permanently into their lungs. Their bare hands, rubbed raw and bleeding by the sharp minerals, moved feverishly to separate the stones, while overseers stood positioned directly behind them, armed with heavy leather straps to ensure the brutal pace never slackened for a moment. The mortality rate among these boys was staggering, yet it was virtually never recorded as a crime. Children were routinely crushed in the heavy iron gears of the conveyors, smothered alive when they lost their footing and slipped into the massive, shifting coal bunkers, or left without limbs from a single moment of absolute exhaustion. Yet, when the broken, blackened bodies were pulled from the machinery, the coal companies had a remarkably efficient legal defense already prepared. According to the exhaustive investigative reports compiled by the National Child Labor Committee between 1904 and 1912, these violent deaths were almost universally registered by local coroners and company physicians as instances of personal carelessness. By officially blaming an exhausted, terrified 8-year-old for his own dismemberment, the mining corporations neatly and legally avoided paying a single cent of compensation to the grieving families. The law effectively declared that the child was at fault for failing to survive the unsurvivable. The horrors of this era, however, were not confined to the dark of the earth. In the sprawling, roaring glass-making factories of the Midwest, children were subjected to a different, blistering kind of hell. The glass boys, as they were commonly known, were largely assigned to the grueling night shifts. From 5 in the evening until 3 in the morning, these children worked merely inches away from open furnaces that burned at upwards of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. They functioned as human conveyor belts, forced to carry globs of molten glass on heavy iron rods that often weighed nearly as much as they did. The physical toll was absolute and irreversible. It was a common sight in these towns to see young boys with deep, permanent burn scars mapped across their arms and faces. Worse still, the intense, unrelenting glare of the furnaces slowly cooked their retinas, trading the temporary, meager wages of a child for a lifetime of early, inescapable blindness. The most chilling aspect of this historical reality was not simply that these barbaric conditions existed, but that they existed in broad daylight, with the full knowledge and tacit approval of society. The police officers patrolling the factory districts saw the maimed, burned children limping home in the freezing dawn. The local physicians who set their shattered bones and treated their ruined lungs understood exactly what had broken them. The politicians who drafted the state laws knew precisely who was being fed to the industrial machine to generate the nation's wealth. Yet, the entire legal and social structure was meticulously designed to look the other way. There was no mystery here, and no question to be puzzled out. The true criminals of the American Industrial Revolution did not lurk in alleyways with pistols, nor did they hide their faces in the shadows. They were men of esteemed standing who wore tailored suits, who sat on the philanthropic boards of charities, and who committed mass, systemic violence under the absolute, unwavering protection of the law. For millions of children across the nation, this vast industrial machinery took their lives slowly, stealing their breath year by year until there was nothing left. But for a 12-year-old girl named Camella Teoli, the violence did not wait. For her, the tragedy arrived in the space of a single fraction of a second. It was the summer of 1911 inside the sprawling complex of the Washington Mill in Lawrence. Camella was a small, slight girl, the daughter of Italian immigrants, who had crossed an ocean with the promise of a better life, only to find themselves tethered to the unforgiving rhythms of the factory. Like countless other children of slender means, she had gone into service young. She spent her days navigating the narrow, violently vibrating aisles between the massive rows of spinning frames. Her job was to replace full bobbins of yarn with empty ones and to untangle the inevitable knots that jammed the works. It was a task that required constant frantic motion, demanding that a child maneuver with the tireless precision of the machines themselves. The equipment she was assigned to navigate that day was a twisting machine, a hulking beast of cast iron and rapidly spinning gears designed to wind heavy threads. Like a great many machines in the Washington Mill, it was missing a crucial component. Basic safety regulations called for metal guards to cover the exposed, interlocking teeth of the heavy gears. However, guards cost money to fabricate and install, and they occasionally slowed down the workers as they reached into the mechanisms to clear jams. In the plain and careless logic of the mill owners, the guards were simply left off. The gears were left spinning openly, a calculated financial decision where the risk was entirely assumed by the workers and the savings were entirely collected by the management. In the deafening roar of the weaving room, where the noise was so absolute that workers communicated only through hand signals, an accident is seldom heard until it is already over. Camella leaned forward toward the iron twisting frame to fix a snag in the cotton line. She was young, she was profoundly exhausted, and the quotas demanded she move fast. The machine was running at full capacity, indifferent to the child working inches from its jaws. As she bent over the frame, a stray lock of her dark hair brushed against the unguarded, spinning gears. The metal teeth did not pause, and they did not yield. In an instant, the machine seized her hair and pulled with the relentless torque of a steam-powered engine. There was no time for her to pull back, and no time to reach for a shut-off valve that she was likely too small to turn anyway. The sheer, mechanical force of the twisting frame violently tore a massive section of her scalp entirely off her head. She was thrown heavily to the oily wooden floor. The deafening clatter of the looms continued to pound through the room, completely indifferent to the sudden burst of bright blood and the piercing scream of a mutilated child. Panic rippled down the long aisles as adult workers rushed forward, desperately trying to halt the machinery and pull the small bleeding girl from the iron wreckage. When you look back at the historical record of that day, the most disturbing element is not merely the physical injury, horrific as it was. It is the profound, terrifying asymmetry of the moment. A living, breathing 12-year-old girl had been pitted against tons of unthinking, unfeeling steel. The machine harbored no malice toward her. It simply did exactly what it was engineered to do by the men who owned it. It consumed whatever was fed into its gears. As Camella lay bleeding on the floor of the Washington Mill, surrounded by frantic laborers, and the overwhelming metallic smell of oil and iron, she stood as a stark, undeniable testament to her absolute powerlessness. She was a child broken by a machine, in a factory that would simply wash the floor, clear the gears, and expect the twisting frame to be running again before the hour was out. Camella Teoli did not die on the oily floor of the weaving room, though there were undoubtedly men sitting in comfortable wood-paneled offices who quietly wished she had. Instead, she was carried out of the noise and into a local hospital, where she would spend the next 7 months suspended in a relentless, waking nightmare. The medical treatments of 1911 were primitive, and the agonizing process of attempting to heal a fully sculpted head involved a grueling series of skin grafts. For over half a year, This 12-year-old girl was confined to a stark, sterile bed, her head wrapped in thick layers of heavy gauze, left to process a level of physical trauma that would break the minds of hardened combat veterans. She survived the initial shock, but she was trapped in an excruciating limbo of constant pain and severe infection. While she lay in the ward fighting for her life, the men who owned the Washington Mill, engaged in the cold, calculated arithmetic of corporate liability. One might expect a powerful conglomerate, faced with the violently mutilated body of a child whose cheap labor enriched them, to offer at least a semblance of human charity. But the textile company did no such thing. They flatly refused to cover the overwhelming majority of her medical expenses, leaving her impoverished immigrant parents to drown in a sea of insurmountable debt. Furthermore, in a final, breathtaking act of bureaucratic cruelty, they terminated Camella's employment immediately. To the corporate board of directors, she was no longer a little girl. She was simply a piece of machinery that had broken down on the factory floor and could no longer meet its daily production quotas. You do not pay to store a ruined gear, and you certainly do not apologize to it. You simply throw it away and install a new one. If the company's absolute lack of empathy was predictable, the total complicity of the local legal system was entirely systemic. There was no police raid on the Washington Mill that afternoon. No detectives arrived to photograph the blood drying on the twisting frame, nor did any magistrate issue warrants to interrogate the floor managers who had explicitly ordered the safety guards to be removed to save a few dollars. In an industrial town like Lawrence, the police, the judges, and the politicians all understood exactly where their livelihoods originated. The sprawling mills generated the city's tax revenue. The mills provided the heartbeat of the local economy. To investigate the wealthy mill owners for a crime would be to bite the hand that fed the entire civic structure. And so, the local authorities quietly agreed among themselves to treat the tearing of a child's scalp not as a criminal act of gross negligence, but as an unfortunate, inevitable byproduct of modern industry. No criminal files were opened. No fines were levied against the corporation. No legal injunctions were filed to force the immediate installation of safety guards on the remaining equipment. The twisting machines were simply wiped down and turned back on, their exposed metal teeth spinning blindly, waiting for the next exhausted child to lean just a fraction of an inch too close. It was decided, almost without a spoken word, that Camella Teoli's suffering was a private matter of no consequence to the wider world. Much like an unidentified corpse shoveled into a pauper's grave in the dead of night, she was fully expected to simply disappear. The polite society of the era held a firm, unspoken belief that the lives of the immigrant working class were entirely expendable. They were the raw fuel shoveled into the roaring furnace of American progress, and it did not occur to the authorities to mourn the ashes. The town, the police, and the mill owners all looked at a severely disfigured little girl, ruined by their own greed, and comfortably concluded that she was a problem that would conveniently fade away into the obscure, impoverished slums of Massachusetts, never to be heard from again. The mill owners and the local authorities believed that Camella Teoli would carry her mutilation and her poverty quietly into the shadows. They expected her to become just another invisible casualty of the industrial machine, a discarded tool left to rust in the dark. What they did not yet know was that the entire town of Lawrence was about to catch fire with outrage. Winter arrived in 1912, bringing with it a bitter, unrelenting cold and a sudden, devastating cut to the workers' already starvation-level wages. It was the final turn of the screw. In the second week of January, a profound and terrifying phenomenon occurred. The immense, deafening looms of the Washington Mill went entirely silent. The quiet spread from building to building until the towering brick fortresses stood dead. Tens of thousands of immigrant workers, people who spoke 24 different languages and had been systematically pitted against each other for years, walked out into the freezing streets as one. This was the birth of the legendary Bread and Roses strike. The workers were no longer merely begging for a few extra pennies to survive the week. They were demanding the fundamental right to be treated as human beings. They marched through the snow, asking not just for the bread of basic survival, but for the roses of a life worth living. As the strike gripped the city, and the local militia was called in to crush the uprising with bayonets and clubs, word of the horrific conditions in Lawrence finally breached the town limits. It reached the ears of progressive reformers and social activists, men and women who refused to accept the brutal calculus of the Gilded Age. These organizers descended upon Lawrence to gather the raw, unfiltered testimonies of the workers. They moved through the freezing, overcrowded tenement houses, knocking on splintered doors to document the starvation, the diseases, and the endless roster of industrial injuries. It was in one of these dimly lit, cramped rooms that they found Camella. She was still in the agonizing throes of recovery, her small head wrapped heavily in layers of soiled gauze. The organizers sat in the cold room and listened to her story. A story that the local police and the factory bosses had successfully buried for months. Much like the stubborn aunt who had come down from the hills of North Carolina to fight for Mary Ellen Smith, these reformers recognized that this 12-year-old girl was the undeniable, bleeding proof of a system that needed to be dismantled. They presented the young girl with a choice that would have terrified a grown man. She could remain in the quiet safety of her tenement, hiding the horrific extent of her injury from a high society that found the working class distasteful to look at. Or she could stand up, leave the only town she knew, and force the millionaire tycoons to look directly at what their greed had done to her. Camella, despite her severe physical trauma and her tender age, chose not to hide. She agreed to step out of the shadows and become the living, breathing indictment of the American textile industry. The plan the reformers devised was completely unprecedented. They organized a congressional hearing to investigate the strikes and the labor conditions in Lawrence, and they intended to bring the evidence in human form. In the bitter cold of late winter, a delegation of striking children was gathered to travel south. Among them was Camella. She was pale, fragile, and terrified, wearing a thick, oversized bandage around her head to conceal the massive skin grafts that had barely begun to heal. Flanked by protective organizers, she walked through the snow and boarded a train bound for Washington, D.C. As the heavy iron wheels began to turn, carrying her away from the towering smokestacks of the mills, she was no longer just a broken factory girl. She was a witness to a crime nobody investigated, traveling to the highest seat of power in the nation, carrying a truth too terrible to be ignored. In the early spring of 1912, the grand marble-lined committee rooms of the United States Capitol presented a jarring, almost surreal contrast to the oil-soaked, violently vibrating floors of the Washington Mill. This was an arena built exclusively for wealthy, powerful men. It was a sanctuary of polished mahogany, soaring ceilings, and quiet, measured deliberation, where the immense fortunes of the American empire were debated and secured. Into this imposing, intimidating space walked Camella Teoli, a 12-year-old girl bearing the terrible physical scars of their economic decisions. When she was called to the witness stand before the Congressional Investigative Committee, she did not speak the language of political theory, nor did she attempt to argue the complex economics of labor strikes. She was simply a child, pale and fragile, with her head heavily wrapped in white bandages. In a small, trembling voice that forced the gathered senators to lean forward in absolute silence just to hear her, she answered their questions. She explained that she had worked for 4 cents an hour. She recounted the exact moment her hair was caught in the unguarded iron gears of the twisting frame, and she described, with the devastatingly simple vocabulary of a child, the profound agony of having her scalp violently torn from her skull. The sheer, unadorned truth of her testimony stripped away every polite, civilized fiction the mill owners had carefully constructed to hide their practices. It is recorded that, as this young girl spoke, outlining a daily horror that was the unspoken reality for millions of American children, The room grew heavy with a collective shame. Sitting in the gallery, the First Lady of the United States, Helen Herron Taft, listened to the child's quiet words and wept openly. The quiet testimony of Camella Teoli could not be contained within those hallowed marble walls. It spilled out into the national press, splashing in bold ink across the front pages of newspapers from coast to coast. A country that had long turned a convenient, profitable blind eye to the suffering of its youngest laborers was suddenly forced to look directly at the blood on its hands. The sheer force of the public outrage proved impossible for the politicians to ignore. In the wake of the hearings, the political machinery began to turn, ultimately culminating in the passage of the Keating-Owen Act. It was a monumental piece of legislation, the very first federal law in American history, specifically designed to prohibit the sale of goods produced by child labor. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the unimaginable courage of one mutilated factory girl had actually managed to break the system, bending the arc of the moral universe toward justice. But the machinery of industrial greed is remarkably resilient, and true historical justice is rarely won in a single emotional battle. The wealthy industrialists, seeing their access to a cheap, endlessly exploitable, and docile labor force threatened, marshaled their vast financial resources and took their fight away from the court of public opinion and into the highest legal authority in the land. In 1918, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling in the case of Hammer v. Dagenhart, 247 U.S. 251. That was as devastating as it was deeply cold-blooded. By a narrow margin, the robed justices declared the Keating-Owen Act entirely unconstitutional. The cruelty of the decision lay in its sterile, detached logic. The court did not deny that children as young as 8 were being maimed in glass factories, smothered in coal mines, or sculpted in textile mills. Instead, they ruled that the federal government simply had no constitutional authority to regulate local labor conditions. They argued that barring the products of child labor from crossing state lines was a gross overreach, one that violated the sacred rights of the corporations to engage freely in interstate commerce. It was a breathtaking, systemic betrayal of the nation's youth. The Supreme Court, standing as the ultimate guardian of American justice, looked at a law explicitly designed to prevent children from being torn apart by industrial gears, and consciously chose to protect the gears. They legally codified the right of a corporation to grind a 12-year-old girl into profit, establishing a terrifying precedent that prioritized the unrestricted flow of capital above the physical safety and the very lives of human beings. Camella Teoli had journeyed from the bloody floor of a Massachusetts textile mill all the way to the steps of the Capitol, armed only with her undeniable truth, only to have the highest court in the nation look at her scars and calmly declare that the freedom of the market mattered more than the flesh of a child. Camella Teoli's profound courage did not win the day in 1918. When the gavel fell and the Supreme Court struck down the child labor laws, the mills simply restarted their engines and continued to consume the young for a little while longer. To the industrialists, it seemed as though the established order had been successfully restored. But true historical justice is rarely measured in the immediate aftermath of a single legal defeat. The horrific, undeniable sight of a 12-year-old girl's torn scalp had done something that no labor strike, no fiery union leaflet, and no political speech could ever achieve. It had fundamentally altered the conscience of an entire nation. The visceral proof of her suffering acted as a permanent, indelible stain on the polished narrative of American industrial progress. Though she was eventually forced to return to a life of quiet, working-class obscurity, her brave testimony planted a resilient seed deep in the bedrock of American law. It would take 2 more decades of relentless struggle, but the public revulsion she ignited eventually culminated in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, a permanent, federal shield that finally dragged the children out from the shadows of the factories and placed them safely into classrooms. When you look back across the vast, shadowed expanse of the Gilded Age, The most striking element of this history is the profound, almost unbelievable contrast at its absolute center. On one side stood a monolithic, multi-million-dollar industrial system. It was an unfeeling leviathan of steam, iron, and unimaginable capital, completely backed by the local police, the regional press, and the highest courts in the land. It was a machine engineered to be entirely invincible. On the exact opposite side stood a frail, impoverished 12-year-old immigrant girl who weighed barely more than the heavy iron bobbins she was forced to carry every day. Yet, when the jagged gears of that unstoppable machine tore into her flesh, she did not simply break and disappear as she was expected to. She endured. Her quiet, unwavering resilience forced the Leviathan to flinch, proving that the immense, crushing weight of an entire corrupt system could still be profoundly challenged by the fragile, enduring truth of a single human body. If you were to walk through the quieted streets of Lawrence today, the brutal landscape of Camella's childhood nightmares has been largely erased by the slow, indifferent passage of time. The deafening, violently vibrating fortresses of the Washington Mill have long since fallen silent. Many of those towering brick walls and vast weaving rooms have been demolished, repurposed, or elegantly renovated into the kind of high-end, exposed brick luxury apartments that cater to individuals who will never know the desperate, biting hunger of a winter strike. The heavy coal smoke has cleared from the sky, and the blood has long been scrubbed from the oily wooden floorboards. Yet, deep beneath the modern pavement and the manicured lawns, the earth does not forget. The soil beneath those heavy stone foundations remains quietly saturated with the stolen youth, the shed blood, and the final, gasping breaths of millions of boys and girls who were fed directly into the furnaces of industrial progress. History, as it is traditionally written in textbooks and proudly etched into marble monuments, is almost exclusively a ledger of great, wealthy men. It honors the visionary tycoons, the brilliant inventors, and the towering politicians who supposedly built a great and prosperous nation from the ground up. But that is the comforting lie that society tells itself to sleep at night. The true, hidden cost of that magnificent American greatness was not paid in gold, nor was it paid in pure ingenuity. It was paid in the dark with the mangled limbs and the silent, unrecorded deaths of countless children. Children whose names no one ever bothered to learn, and whose murders no one ever bothered to investigate.